Good afternoon, everyone. Hi, I'm Liz Krueger, State Senator, 28th District. Welcome to the second of our five-part series that we're doing on different housing issue at lunch hour. So today's topic is you've fallen behind on your rent. Now what? As always, we continue to have closed captioning option on either version that you might be using today. If you are on Zoom, click live transcript in the meeting controls section. And if you're in the Facebook Live event, you'll see a settings button on the bottom right-hand corner that you have to click the CC on to activate the process. As always, we're recording our forum, and everyone who's on the RSVP list will receive an email with links to the forum in the mail, probably in the email, probably within a couple of days. That will include all the resources that we're putting into chat during this presentation, and also our presenters' PowerPoint. So while you'll be getting lots and lots of information today, don't feel that you have to write everything down, because it's all going to be sent to you within a matter of days. New York's housing and affordability crisis has been affecting all types of tenants. My staff and I hear regularly from constituents who have fallen behind on their rent, are struggling to pay ongoing rent, are at risk of being taken to housing court, or have already experienced being there. This is a topic particularly close to my heart, since I used to run an eviction prevention and anti-poverty programs for families before being elected into the state Senate. This afternoon, we will hear from Laurie, who is currently the executive director at Housing Court Answers and the former director at Met Council on Housing. She has spent decades advocating for justice and fairness for tenants who are in housing court without representation, which is the vast majority of tenants. And Jenny's going to help you assess your situation, teach you how to make a plan for paying back your arrears, and providing information about financial resources. I have known Jenny a very long time, and actually at one time was on the board of directors of Housing Court Answers back before I was a senator. She's an extraordinary advocate and extraordinarily knowledgeable about these topics. After Jenny's made her presentation, I'll be coming back on with her to moderate a Q&A session. And many of you have already sent your questions in, and others can choose to add questions during Jenny's presentation by typing into the Q&A section of whichever version you're on. And my staff will try to add those to the list. We'll see how many questions we actually can get to in the short amount of time, because again, we're doing everything in 1 hour. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Laurie for her presentation. Thanks for being with us, Jenny.
Thank you very much, Senator Krueger. It's a real pleasure to be with your audience. And excuse my hoarseness. I just want to say that Senator Krueger has been a real champion for tenants and for programs that help tenants basically prevent their eviction from losing their homes, and has been a real champion for helping tenants who face housing court. So if you live in her district, you're in a good district. If you live in New York, you're lucky to have her as our state senator. I'm going to start sharing my PowerPoint, and I'll talk about rent arrears or back rent. Once again, I'm from Housing Court Answers. We are a nonprofit, and we get funding to help tenants who don't have lawyers who are facing eviction in housing court. So we run a hotline 5 days a week, Monday through Friday, 9 to 5. And we have information tables in the housing courts. Our Manhattan information table is at the housing court at 111 Center Street. We are on the second floor in the clerk's office. If you come into the clerk's office, we're to the right. So anyone who has to go to housing court, if you don't have an attorney, or even if you do and you have questions, about the housing court case or about your rent issues, please feel free to stop in. We are there Monday through Thursday, 9 to 5. So we're not there on Fridays, and we're not there on court holidays, of course. We'll be closed this next Thursday for the Thanksgiving holiday, when the courts are closed as well. As I said, we have a hotline, and our hotline number is on the screen now. It's 212-962-4795. We're open Monday through Friday, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. It is sometimes hard to get through to our hotline. And so I would just caution folks, if you had tried to get through and you get a busy signal or you're on hold for a while, is to try either early in the day or late in the afternoon. Our busiest times are sort of during the lunch break. Just try again if you don't get through. I want to talk about back rent today, and I'm assuming everyone on this webinar is a tenant who has to pay rent every month. And, there are a couple million tenants in New York City, and at any given time, a few 100,000 of us are behind on the rent. Sometimes a little bit, sometimes a lot. And I just wanted to say there's no shame in falling behind on the rent. The rents in New York are mostly out of our control for most of us. If you're a rent stabilized tenant, or you have a subsidy, or you live in some kind of housing that has some income and rent restrictions, you're lucky. You may have an affordable rent, but most New Yorkers do not have an affordable rent. More than half of New Yorkers pay more than half of their income for rent. So I just want to emphasize that falling behind on the rent is common in New York, and there's no shame. Folks who get behind on the rent should not feel like they have to hide the fact. They should basically try to make a plan for preventing eviction. Because if you get too far behind on the rent, the landlord can take you to housing court in an eviction proceeding. And if you don't pay the back rent that you owe, you could get evicted, and we don't want that. And I just want to also add that a very small number of people, compared to those who get taken to housing court, actually get evicted for non-payment of rent. So there are a lot of programs in New York City and New York State. There's a lot of help out there for folks. So I would just caution everyone not to get feeling ashamed about it, feeling that you have to hide the situation, feeling that there's no help out there, because there is. So I'll talk about all the different programs that are available to tenants who are behind on the rent, and a little bit about how to approach your situation. So the first thing we always say to folks is, like, what is your situation? What kind of apartment do you live in? What's the status of your tenancy? And some people know the answers to those questions instantly, and some people don't. So for starters, do you have a lease in your name? Are you rent stabilized? Are you rent controlled? Do you live in NYCHA? Do you have a Section 8 voucher? Are you an unregulated apartment? Are you possibly covered by the new law called the Good Cause Eviction Law? These are unregulated tenants who live in apartment buildings that are 10 or more units that aren't in co-ops or condominiums. So you might be living in an unregulated or deregulated apartment in an apartment building, and you might be covered by that. So there's rent restrictions on that, rent increase restrictions. What is your monthly rent? So think about if you get invoices from the landlord, if you have a lease, if you have some sort of a rental agreement, write that number down. What is your rent now in November, December of 2024? And sometimes there are ways to argue that your rent is too high, or that there's a mistake in the invoice. Sometimes you get behind on the rent and the landlord sends you an invoice and the landlord adds in legal fees and late fees, and your rent is $1,800 a month, and you get an invoice from the landlord saying you owe $10,000 because the landlord has thrown in all these legal fees and late fees and other things. So try to write down what your actual rent is. Like what do you owe each month in rent? Just rent, not fees, just rent. And then the other thing to look at if you are getting behind on the rent is, what is your monthly income? How does money come into your house? Do you have a job and that's your only income? Do you have maybe Social Security retirement? Do you have maybe Social Security disability income? Do you have some other kind of income? You might be on public assistance. You might get a combination of public assistance and Social Security or SSI. You might have some disability income. You also might have family members or roommates who live in your house. When you're talking about a roommate, if you have a roommate, you should count what they contribute to the rent every month as part of the monthly income available to pay rent. And then if you have family members who live in the house with you, do they have any kind of income, or do they have maybe some public benefits or something else that they can contribute? So when you're trying to figure out how to pay the rent, figure out how money is coming into the house and how much it is every month. Like not your gross income, but your net income. So like, what's your paycheck after your taxes are taken out? And then the other thing to know, of course, is how much back rent you owe. And sometimes this is very confusing to find out. Sometimes landlords sort of exaggerate how much you owe. As I said before, sometimes the landlord will send you an invoice or a rent bill, which has not just the monthly rent that you owe, but also a lot of confusing late fees or legal fees. A lot of those fees cannot be collected, or they cannot be collected in housing court. So it's important to separate out what you actually owe in back rent. So we always ask people if they can go back to a zero balance. And that's a little bit confusing, but it means go back in time to the last time that you didn't owe any back rent, right? So that might have been 2 months ago. It might have been 6 months ago. It might have been years ago. You may be carrying a balance forward, but just try to go back to the last time that you didn't owe any back rent, and then figure out, just adding up your monthly rent, what you've paid each month and what you owe. The next thing that folks need to do if they're behind on the rent is figure out how much of that was due, how much of the back rent that they owe was due to some crisis in life, or was it due to just the rent outstripping income, or maybe other bills getting in the way, right? So did you lose your job? Were your hours cut? Did you lose a benefit that you had? Maybe you didn't recertify for something on time and you lost a benefit. And then when you're done figuring out all of those things, you need to figure out, are you currently paying your rent, or can you pay rent going forward, right? So this is a really important point. You have to figure out your situation, and then you fall into basically 2 buckets. One bucket is you have enough money to pay your rent going forward, but you are behind on the rent and you owe back rent. So once again, in order to get assistance from a city program or a private social service organization, you should make a list of all the rent payments that you've made, look at any notices you got from the landlord, get all your income documents together. Other members of the household, as I said, if they have income, get as much information together as you can about the income from other members of your household. If you are behind on the rent and you can pay ongoing rent, you should do it. It's important to pay ongoing rent if you're able to pay ongoing rent. If you're applying for back rent assistance, organizations that help with back rent are going to ask you, can you pay ongoing rent? And if you say yes, if you're not doing it, they'll say, why aren't you doing it? That indicates that maybe you can't. And that puts you, as I said, in a different bucket. So the second situation is you're behind on the rent and you do not have enough income to pay future rent. So that means that you maybe lost your job and you're getting unemployment benefits, but the unemployment benefits aren't enough to pay ongoing rent, or you have retired and your rent has outstripped your Social Security or your pension. There could be a number of reasons why this happens. But also in this situation, you also want to try to figure out how far behind you are on the rent. Try to get back again to a point where you didn't owe any rent. And also figure out like how much of your rent can you pay going forward. You will need enough income if you can possibly do it. Try to be as close to being able to pay 30% of your gross income as you can. And then also figure out like, do you have people living in your house who are not contributing? Do you have a roommate who could contribute more? Are there family members who can help? So try to get all that information together. If you're behind on the rent and you do not have enough income to pay future rent, you should start thinking about ways to pay future rent. So there are only so many ways, right? So if you're a rent stabilized tenant and your rent is a certain amount, you may be eligible for some rent freezes, but that's not necessarily going to lower your rent to where you can afford it. So there are programs like SCREE, the Senior Citizen Rent Increase Exemption Program. There's DRE, the Disability Rent Increase Exemption Program, that are available to seniors and people with disabilities. If you're a rent stabilized tenant, if you have some kind of a subsidy, you live in subsidized housing, NYCHA, Section 8 are the most common ones, then your rent is fixed to 30% of your income. So that should be easy to figure out. You should be able to afford your rent going forward. Maybe there needs to be some kind of fix to the rent. But also looking at sources of income for those who do not have a subsidy. So getting a roommate if you don't have a roommate. If you live in a rent stabilized or rent controlled apartment or an unregulated apartment, you have a right under New York state law to have a roommate. You want to be careful when picking a roommate that you find someone who is reliable, someone obviously who you can live with, and someone who is going to pay the rent reliably every month. If you're in a rent stabilized apartment or a rent controlled apartment, you're allowed to charge one room. If you have one roommate and you live alone, you're allowed to charge them half the rent. So just for, as a sample, if my rent is $2,000 a month and I have a roommate, I could ask the roommate to contribute $1,000 a month. More than that, under rent stabilization, you're getting into trouble for if you charge more than a proportionate share of the rent to your roommate. I would just caution folks, if you're getting a roommate, as I said before, be careful. Maybe find a friend who can recommend somebody. We see a lot of folks who have, not a lot, but a few situations, roommate situations, where the roommate's unable to contribute to the rent, and then there are problems, obviously. Also, think about if there are benefits that you are not receiving that you might be eligible for. Apply some of the benefits. Social Security disability, for example, can take a year or two to be approved. So you want to start that process as early as possible. And also be thinking of what we call third parties. That is somebody who is willing to contribute something to your rent. This could be a family member or friends who will contribute. You might only need $200 or $300 a month. Sometimes you can get that by going out to family members or friends. And sometimes we talk about, someone might say, well, I don't want to ask my family for money. And then we'll say, well, what happens if you get evicted and you lose your housing? Are you going to have to move in with your kids? Is that what they want? Wouldn't they, maybe they prefer to contribute to your rent every month rather than help you once you get evicted, which is much more expensive, obviously. The common, the programs that provide the most help with back rent are listed on the screen now. So we have the one-shot deal, which is a city program, public assistance. There are vouchers, and there are private charities that help with small amounts of back rent. These are for folks who have figured out their plan. So the one-shot deal is a loan. Usually, most of them are a loan from the city to a tenant to prevent their eviction. They can cover large amounts of back rent, and you apply through the Human Resources Administration. You can go to your local center, or you can apply online at Access HRA. So the beginning process is pretty simple. It takes a long time, and it can be complicated at the end. So we just always urge people to start as soon as you can. It is a loan for most folks unless you have SSI in your household. And so that means it has to be repaid. HRA pretends they're not flexible about the repayment terms, but they are. So don't let that stop you if the alternative is getting evicted. In order to get a one-shot deal, you have to show that you have future ability to pay the rent. And we talked about that already. And you need a clear explanation as well as documentation showing how you fell behind on the rent. At least one person in your household must have immigration status to be eligible for this. The next thing I'm going to talk about is just going on regular public assistance. So if you have no income in your house, you can apply for public assistance. This is an ongoing monthly assistance from the state for very low income or no income households. Some people who get Social Security retirement, the amount that they get is so low that they are actually eligible for additional public assistance. So having some income in the house, you might also be eligible. Again, you start the application through HRA. They don't provide a lot of money for rent, but it can be something to basically at least start the process of trying to prevent your eviction. Folks who are in public housing or have a subsidy and have no income need to go on public assistance as sort of a matter of policy. And then the rent should be adjusted to equal the amount of the public assistance for shelter. There's a program for, there are two programs for people who can't afford their rent going forward and qualify for public assistance. That is, they have very low income. The FEPS program, the Family Homelessness and Eviction Prevention Supplement, provides an additional amount of money to families with children under 18 in the household who have an open public assistance case and are facing eviction because their rent is higher than the public assistance amount. You apply through HRA. This program also takes a long time for the process to work itself out. So apply early if this sounds like you. There are home bases in the city. I think Services for the Underserved is the home base that SUS is the home base that serves Senator Krueger's district. City FEPS is a similar program. It helps low-income adults without minor children in the household. Currently, the city administration is requiring folks who apply to this program have an active adult protective services case or have New York City shelter history. And you apply also through home base for this. And then finally, there are private charities that help with back rent. These charities help with small amounts of back rent. Sometimes a tenant can get a little bit of rent from a private charity and a one-shot deal, and the two combined together can stop the eviction. Some private organizations cover rent, utilities, furniture, other kinds of necessities. They can provide money for food if you have no food in the house. If you call our hotline, we can do a screening. I'm sure Senator Krueger's office also can help you figure out whether you might qualify. And then part of this is if you are active in a church or a synagogue or a social organization or a senior center, don't leave any stones unturned, right? So go to the folks there who do the social service outreach. Most churches, most synagogues have someone on staff who help parishioners or members. And so do reach out if you belong to any of these organizations. Many of the charities, the bigger charities, there's Met Council on Jewish Poverty, there's Catholic charities, many of them are connected to church or synagogue networks. So you can get into those programs by asking at your local organization. As I said, you can also call our hotline. We do screenings for folks to see who might be eligible for these programs. And then finally, just some general things to remember, and we'll take questions. In order to apply for almost every program, you need to have birth certificates, social security cards, and pay statements or pay stubs for everyone in the house. If you have social security income, if you have a pension, you would need to gather all those documents and have proof that you have that income. So sometimes it's hard for some of us to remember where all these documents are. So start early looking for them, or getting duplicates if you need to. You'll also need proof of how you fell behind. So if you lost your job and you got a termination letter, if you're receiving unemployment benefits, make sure you have a copy of those documents. And you don't generally need these documents in paper. If you were emailed something and you just save that, that's good. But you will need documents. So if you had a death in the family, for example, and you paid for funeral expenses and you have a canceled check and the invoice from the funeral home, that's good. If you had an illness in you or in the family and you have some hospital records or doctor records, doctor's notes for that, you can provide that. So for instance, let's say you lost your job because you have a child with asthma and you were out too often. Those two things, the termination from your job and the medical notices about or doctor's notes about the child's asthma will help. And then finally, some programs do require that you have a non-payment case in housing court. Some programs say that you need that and you don't really. But if you do have a case in housing court, or if the landlord has sent you a letter saying the landlord's going to start a case against you, gather those documents. And just for example, HRA, if you apply for a one-shot deal, they might turn you down and say, oh, you have to have a case in housing court. Well, in fact, you don't have to have a case in housing court. So if that happens to you, you should reapply. So I'm going to stop sharing now. Yes, I think for questions, is that
Perfect.
sound good? Yes, okay.
Thank you so much. So appreciate the presentation. And I'm just looking, I'm going to start with the questions that we got in advance, and then we'll double check. I know some people typed in questions that my staff could already answer for them if they were doing it online, but we will try to get to everything. So I know you talked about one-shot deals. Here's a question. I applied for a one-shot deal 3 times and was denied. I will be in contempt of court if I do not pay. What advice tactics do you have for people who keep getting denied for a one-shot deal?
Yes, and I will say two things about that. One is that you should look over your applications and figure out maybe what you're doing wrong. But in addition to that, HRA is very understaffed and they have a lot of new staff. And I don't think I'm being cruel if I say a lot of them don't know what they're doing. So we see every day we see people who are denied a one-shot deal for they don't have a case in housing court. On Tuesday, a woman called us and said that they told her that she was denied because her arrears were too low. Crazy, absurd. So you have to be thinking about like, what did I do wrong? And maybe it's something going wrong at HRA. So keep that in mind. Do you have future ability? Are you paying the ongoing rent, right? If you are paying the ongoing rent, show them your canceled checks. Sometimes people think they don't have to pay the ongoing rent until they get the one-shot deal, and that's not true. They want to see that you're paying the ongoing rent. So the other thing is, do you have proof of why you fell behind? Sometimes they don't accept something that you provided. So you might say, I don't have any work, but you don't have any proof that you were actually terminated from your job. Sometimes they want to see that you have applied for unemployment benefits. If you qualify for them, there could be a number of things. So you just sort of have to look at the situation. It's sort of a case by case situation. But I would not forget that there are many people who apply repeatedly. You can also, I don't know exactly how it works, but you used to be able to go to the 5th floor in housing court, and maybe Senator Krueger's staff know this. And there were HRA folks there who in the what we call the right to counsel room, or right to counsel people who would be able to sort of like look at some of the decisions that you got to see why you fell behind and maybe give you some advice about reapplying with different information or different documents.
Great. So there are different reasons people get denied for a one-shot deal. Could you already said, HRA staff may not know and may be making the wrong decision. But is there sort of a standard set of examples of why you would legitimately be said no to for a one-shot?
Yes, absolutely. So a common one is that you're not proving that you have future ability to pay your rent. So this means that today, on November 21st, I can write a check. I will be able to write a check for December's rent on December 1st, and the check will clear. So they really want to know that if they pay your back rent, you are going to be able to carry on by yourself in the future. So if you can't prove that you either are paying your ongoing rent or that you can pay your ongoing rent, you need to get that proof together somehow. So the best proof is by paying it. So that's a common one. The other one that we see commonly is that you didn't have an emergency that put you behind. So they don't consider things that we might think of as critical. They don't think of those as critical expenses. So sometimes people pay their phone bill, their utilities, their cable bill, things like that, instead of paying their rent. It could be other things, right? Like a really common one we get is there's a death in the family. And you contributed money to the funeral expenses, but you didn't pay the funeral home. You gave the money to a family member who wrote the check to the funeral home. So sometimes it's just, if you could just get some proof of that, of like how you fell behind. And sometimes it's just, they don't accept the reason why you're behind at all, and they never will. So if you have a car, and you're spending money on car expenses, if you have children in private schools and you're paying tuition, those are not acceptable reasons for being behind on the rent. Whatever you think about that, no judgment here from me. know that those are not considered things that should come before your rent. So people do that. So think about like, how are you behind on the rent? What made you fall behind? The reasons they're looking for are job loss, reduction in hours at your job. You lost some sort of a benefit through no fault of your own, maybe, or maybe you just didn't recertify. You're in the hospital, so you didn't file your SCREE renewal. There could be a lot of, things like that. And a death in the family or an illness. So those are the things that they're looking for.
Great. Thank you. So I have a lot of older adults in my district. And by definition, older adults are not that likely to be able to go out and go to work or get more work or higher pay. And very often their sole source of income at this point might be Social Security with a little savings that they've been going through pretty quickly in today's market, even if they are in rent stabilized housing. What other options do we have for acquiring financial assistance and paying ongoing rent when the truth is our income just isn't enough to keep paying the rent and it's not going to change?
Yeah, unfortunately, that's a situation that's pretty common. As I said at the beginning, more than half of tenants pay, 50% of their income for rent, but it's frightening how many people pay 70 to 75% of their income for rent. So that is a situation, a sad situation that exists. If you're getting your full Social Security and you remind everyone about SCREE, Senior Citizen Rent Increase Exemption, which can freeze your rent. If you're facing a rent increase that is, you have to be paying a third of your income for rent in order to qualify, be 62 or older, and have an income at 50,000 or below. But beyond that, the situation that the thing that we recommend mostly is is getting a roommate or getting support from family members. And that's hard, no doubt, but there aren't many other ways to get out of that situation. You just need to increase the income in your house if you can't lower your rent.
So here's a very long example question that came in, but I think it's not so uncommon without every detail. So I had to go through housing court, but I couldn't get a lease from my landlord. And because I couldn't get a lease, I couldn't get the one shot from HRA approved. And even though the court ordered the landlord to give me a correct lease, they apparently kept giving me incorrect leases to drag out the time period where I couldn't get a one shot, hence I couldn't make the payment, even though it was because HRA says I need to see a legitimate lease. I couldn't get the lease because the landlord violated the court order. What am I supposed to do in that situation?
Yeah, so sometimes we suggest to people that they sign an incorrect lease, depending on what the problem with it is, just to basically get HRA to approve the one-shot deal. And then obviously separate from that is doing something called an order to show cause, which is a motion that you can file in housing court. You can do it without a lawyer. You can go to our information table on the second floor or the help center on the first floor, Manhattan Housing Court, to get help doing one if you need. And bring a copy of the bad leases and the judge's decision or order saying that the landlord has to provide a correct lease, and ask the judge to give you more time to get the one-shot deal, and ask the judge to order the landlord again to provide a proper lease, and try to write out what is wrong with it and include copies of everything. So it's a two-step process, But the first step is, if you need more time, is do an order to show cause in housing court in order to get more time to pay and to alert the judge to the fact that it is the landlord's fault, not your fault. And I think you're having a housing court session in this series later where folks will get more and better information than I can give you. I'm not a housing lawyer, so I'm not a lawyer, so I can't really advise you on that stuff. But I can tell you, without a lawyer, you can do an order to show cause and alert the judge to the fact that the landlord is not complying with the settlement agreement or with the judge's order.
Thank you. So you talked a bit about landlord, about getting a roommate to help you with the rent, and you even talked about the rules in the context of rent regulation that you really can't charge more than the percentage of the apartment that they are using. But are there other things you need to know about when it's legal or not legal to get a roommate? Do you need to get permission from your landlord and something in writing about that?
Yeah, so you don't, if you're a rent stabilized tenant, you do not need permission from the landlord to get a roommate. You can get a roommate, and then if the landlord asks if you have a roommate, you need to notify the landlord that yes, you have a roommate, and give the landlord the roommate's name. And that's it. You don't need permission. Rent control is pretty similar. Rent control is a little bit different. I don't know how many rent control tenants you have in your district or who are on this webinar.
I'll have a few. Yep.
Yeah, but rent control tenants also can have roommates. It's a little complicated if you already have a roommate, but you're allowed to have your immediate family live with you and have a roommate. And the overcrowding rules, which are often raised by landlords, are actually not enforced in New York. If they were, we'd all be in trouble. And that is not a reason not to have a roommate. I mean, it might be uncomfortable to have a roommate in a very small apartment, obviously. But don't think of that so much. And then if you have a subsidy, if you live in New York City public housing or a Section 8 apartment, or you have some other subsidy program like that, you are not allowed to have a roommate, and your rent should be affordable to you. That aside, I don't know if you have Mitchell-Lamas in your district, but those usually Mitchell-Lama residents cannot have roommates either. So those folks are prohibited. If you live in an apartment that's unregulated, there is a New York state law that allows everyone to have a roommate unless you live in federally or states or city subsidized housing. So anyone can have a roommate, but sometimes landlords don't like it. So there's no law against you having a roommate if you live in an unregulated apartment or a market rate apartment, but you may have a dust up with your landlord over it if you do that. The other thing, I just said this before, and it doesn't answer this question directly, but just be very careful about who the roommate is, right? So don't find someone off the street. Don't get someone off, I don't know if Craigslist still exists, but people used to get roommates off Craigslist, and sometimes those were a disaster. Find someone that you know or trust. Lots of people looking for housing in New York, so there are very honest, good roommates out there, and so find someone that you check their references, talk to people who they've shared housing with before.
Great. What happens if I can pay some of the arrears but not all? Does that write off my possibility for a one shot? I actually think it would help me with a one shot. Can you negotiate with your landlord to only pay a portion of the rent every month, even though you're building up arrears? How does that work?
Yeah, and that really depends on the landlord. Some landlords are willing to work with tenants, and especially if they think the situation is going to resolve itself. So we saw this a lot during COVID, right? A lot of landlords recognized that their tenants were out of work and assume that at some point in the future, they would be back at work and would be able to recover, and did not, and lowered rent for folks or forgave back rent for folks. It's not happening now as much, but some landlords will negotiate, and you just have to think about who your landlord is and what kind of relationship you have with them. A lot of us have very corporate landlords, so we wouldn't even know, who to talk to. There's a managing agent. But yes, you can try that for sure. So it just depends on who your landlord is. Eventually, your landlord, if you're behind on the rent and your landlord's not accepting of that, the landlord will eventually take you to housing court. If you paid some of the back rent or you're paying some of the ongoing rent, as I said before, make sure you keep track of that, because landlords are notorious in housing court for charging tenants rent that they've already paid, or fees or late fees, legal fees that they don't owe. So just make sure you keep track of what rent you've paid. Certainly, if you can contribute to the back rent and you can pay your ongoing rent, you are in a much better situation for getting a one-shot deal or help from charities.
Got it. And yeah, I can't emphasize enough the importance of getting receipts for the amount you've paid, or if your check, holding on to that canceled check, because it is really crucial in any of these situations that you have documentation. Because yes, sometimes landlords do lie. Sometimes you're in a dispute, but the building has been sold, so they're telling you you owe money from a previous landlord, but you've paid the previous landlord, who's not part of the deal anymore. So it is really important that everybody try to make sure they get receipts and they hold on to the evidence.
Yeah, let me just add to that. Rent only, right? So recently someone called our hotline who was being charged, the building had been sold, and you were talking about that. That's what reminded me of it. And the new landlord billed them for the security deposit. And they thought, well, can I get evicted for that? They were afraid they were going to get evicted for that. No, you can't be evicted. The old landlord just stole the security deposits, probably. Who knows what happened? But
Right.
yeah, you just make sure it's rent, right? If you're paying rent, it's a good idea too to, if you pay by money order or check or however you pay, make sure you say, this is for November 2024 rent only, so that the landlord's not attributing your payments to a security deposit a previous landlord stole, or fees, or legal fees or late fees that the landlord is charging.
Great, that is really important. Thank you. When I apply for a one shot, do I have to let them know I have a roommate? I don't want my roommate to know I've fallen behind on the rent.
You need to tell them, you need to tell HRA when you apply for the one shot, all of your sources of income and that are available to pay the rent. So if you have a roommate contributing to the rent, that's good, especially if it gives you future ability, and you need to tell HRA that. I don't know how you hide the situation from the roommate forever. There are, yeah, I understand not wanting, and I would just go back to what I said in the beginning, is that you're in the same situation as probably a million other people in New York City today, being behind on the rent, and there's no shame in it. And most of us, if we could afford our rent, we wouldn't have roommates. So I would just urge you to be honest with the roommate. I'm sorry to
No, that's
bend
very
the
helpful.
question that way, but yeah.
Yep. A variation. I'm running some kind of work or business activity from my apartment, and that's how I'm helping to pay my rent, but I still need a one shot. So I have to report that income to HRA. But I noticed in my lease, it said I can't operate businesses from my apartment. What do I do in that situation?
Yeah, so the business rule for the apartment really depends on what you're doing. So your lease probably prohibits any kind of business that is bringing traffic into the building, or bringing manufacturing process or chemicals or other things like that. You should look it over pretty carefully. There is a rule about rent stabilization where you can't be using most of your apartment primarily for a business. So if you have a rent stabilized apartment and you're running a travel agency out of it, but you live somewhere else, you're not entitled to keep your rent stabilization status under that situation. But many of us work from home. Millions of New Yorkers. I'm working from home right now. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with you doing some kind of work that requires a phone or a computer from home. And yeah, in terms of applying for a one-shot deal, the landlord does not see your application for the one-shot deal. The landlord sees everything you submit in housing court, but there are privacy rules so that the landlord doesn't have access to all of your tax returns or anything like that, unless you voluntarily share them. So just make sure if you're applying for the one-shot deal and you're working from home, that you have proof of that income, if that makes sense.
Yes, yes. So I can't pay my rent. How long is it going to take for the landlord to evict me?
It depends on the landlord. A landlord can start a non-payment case if you're 1 month behind on the rent. Some landlords wait a really long time to start that case against you. You might want to just make a plan, right? So keep in mind that if you get behind on the rent and you move out, the landlord can get a judgment against you if you have a lease to pay the rent and you move out before the lease expires. So if you have a lease that's coming up for renewal and you know you can't afford it, make a plan and don't renew the lease. If you move out mid-lease and the landlord sues you, or the landlord sues you now for non-payment of rent, the landlord can get a money judgment against you. And even if you give up the apartment, the landlord can keep that money judgment and collect it later, which means garnishing your salary, attaching bank accounts. So you want to try to avoid that situation and be clear-eyed about, a lot of landlords are happy if we move out. They can usually, not always, if it's rent stabilized, they're not supposed to increase the rent, but sometimes they'll release you from the lease. So just think about what your plan is, right? If you're going to move out, you're move to another place, move in with family members, try to get out of the situation without carrying a judgment, because a housing court case can take months to get you actually out of the apartment, especially today. Cases can drag on quite a bit, but there still might be a money judgment after that, and it may make it harder for you to get loans in the future. Your credit card interest will be higher. I mean, there's a lot of sort of secondary impacts that having a money judgment has. So try to avoid that if you can.
So what happens if I sign a stipulation that I'll pay within 30 days? I'm working to get that, emergency rent assistance or negotiating with family and friends to help me, but I'm hitting 30 days and I just need more time. Is there a way to get an extension on a stipulation?
Yes, you do an order to show cause in housing court. Look at your stipulation and see whether it has a judgment in it. You may have, when you signed your stipulation, you may have consented to a judgment for the money, and you may have consented to a warrant. If that's the case, if you miss the deadline for paying, the landlord can try to hire a marshal to start the eviction process. So you definitely want to do an order to show cause if you reach the 30 days and you haven't made the payments required. If there's no judgment and warrant, the landlord usually has to go back to court to get those. So that takes a while. If you think you're going to get it within a few days of the 30 days, then there's no judgment and warrant in your stipulation. Keep working on getting the money together. If you can't do that, you need to do an order to show cause in housing court. If you do that, you need to show how much money you've paid, and you have to have proof that you paid it. And then also you want proof of anything you're working on, right? So letters from family members, the status of your one-shot deal application. You want to attach those to your order to show cause, which is basically getting permission from the court to have another 30 days or more time to pay the back rent.
Got it. Just looking, I have time for one more, and I'm just trying to decide which one. Oh, rent-controlled tenants qualify for financial assistance options. There's nothing that says a rent-controlled tenant can't be eligible, right? And most of them are very elderly and probably quite poor. Right?
Yeah, so yeah, rent control tenants have access to all the same benefits and programs that rent stabilized tenants have. There's no restriction on there.
And
Sometimes the
Yep.
HRA wants a lease and you have to tell them
Yes.
rent control tenants don't have leases
Yeah.
and they don't believe you.
Yeah.
And so that's maybe reaching out to Senator Krueger's staff to, I don't know. We run into this regularly because there's so few rent control tenants left and very few people understand the programs and how it works.
Exactly. And again, this is a good time to raise SCREE and DREE again, the rent freeze program. If you're elderly or disabled, your rent is, and you're living in rent controlled or rent regulated housing, you could be eligible to have your rent frozen by filing an application, which my office can help you with the Department of Finance. And it's sort of like the lottery, frankly, for people who are eligible, because your rent will continue to go up every year, but you won't be paying it. The landlord will actually collect a reduction in their property taxes of the equivalent amount. And so it's really such an important program. And there are still enormous numbers of people who are eligible but not applying for it. So I can't emphasize that enough. One more quick question. When it says you must have immigration status for a one-shot, what's the definition? I mean, there's a lot of different immigration status. Any status, any definition?
Yeah, that's a good question that I can't really answer. So if I will tell you this, if no one in your house has any status at all, you cannot get the one-shot deal. There are charitable resources for folks, especially those sponsored by churches. But yeah, I think you can get a one-shot deal if you have a green card. But I don't know the varying, I mean, I know there are other kinds of statuses that you can get a one-shot deal, but I can't tell you.
And they may
what
be
they are.
changing rapidly under the new administration.
Well, I was gonna say, if that's you, apply before January 20th.
Yeah. All right, I have to cut you off because I have to thank you profusely before the clock hits 1. I have to remind everybody that this was the second of 4 sessions in our virtual housing lunch hour series. The third session will be December 3rd on appearing in housing court without a lawyer. The fourth session will be December 5th, rights and resources for co-op and condo owners. And then we're also rolling out a series for older adults, our annual virtual older adult resource fair. That will be 3 sessions in December. The first one on December 6th, focusing on making connections while solo and aging. December 12th, arts and culture for older New Yorkers. And third, December 13th, for legal resources for older New Yorkers. As ever, you can apply, you can RSVP through our system that you use today. And I just want to thank you again, Jenny, for being with us, having such good answers. And of course, you can always call my office 212-490-9535 to reach out to my staff, or make sure you join Liz list at www.lizkrueger.com so that you automatically get all of these updates sent to you by internet, which means no trees died. So www.lizkrueger.com. I hope everybody has a wonderful Thanksgiving. We all need a good celebration right now. And I'll see you on the next webinar. Thank you so much. Bye.